Welcome everyone today. Thanks for being here. If I can get all the panelists to put on their videos, that'd be great. Thank you. All right. So, hi, I'm Allison Lassiter. I am an assistant professor here at Penn, where I am in the Department of City and Regional Planning, and I lead our Smart Cities concentration. One of the things I do is I teach a course called Introduction to Smart Cities. If you're interested in the syllabus, you can see it at intro-to-smartcities.com. And I was motivated in the context of that class to start this panel to think about how we can use artificial intelligence in the city. So we have some really exciting panelists here today. I'm going to introduce you to all of them, and then we will get going. So first up on my list, alphabetically, is John Paul Farmer. And John Paul Farmer works for WeLink Cities now, but previously he served as the third Chief Technology Officer of New York City, where he developed the first major artificial intelligence strategy in the US, also the NYC Internet Master Plan, and the NYC Internet of Things strategy. He also co-chairs the 50-member Cities Coalition for Digital Rights. Next up, we have Avi Fuelle. She's the Global Policy Director at Credo AI. Credo works on responsible AI strategies with all of the major technology companies around the US and many around the world. She develops Credo's policy philosophy and then translates that policy into product. Prior to joining Credo, Evie served for 3 years as the advisor digital economy policy of the delegation of the European Union to the United States. Okay, next up, we have Emily Royall. Emily is coming to us from San Antonio, Texas, where she's currently the Smart Cities Administrator. She's worked on a number of initiatives there, one of them being the new Smarter Together Smart Cities Roadmap. And now they are working on an AI strategy as well. She currently advises UN Habitat's People-Centered Smart Cities flagship program and has authored 6 UN playbooks on smart cities for local governments. And finally, we have Ethan Zuckerman. He's an associate professor in public policy, information, and communication at UMass Amherst. He directs the initiative for digital public infrastructure. He's the author of many articles and books. One of those books is called Mistrust: Why Losing Faith in Institutions Provides the Tools to Transform Them. And I'd like to note that we were also supposed to be joined by Santiago Garces, but he had a last-minute conflict and had to cancel. In some ways, this works out really well for us because now we have a little bit more time for questions at the end. So I wanted to give you the heads up that you should be filing away some questions, and you can enter those in the Q&A, and we'll be pulling some of those out at the end to chat about. Okay, so one of the objectives today is to think more critically about AI in the city. Oftentimes, conversations can be really polarizing. They can be really for AI, all of its magic, or they can be really against AI and all of its evil. So here we're trying to find a path forward and think about both the positives and cautions around AI and what our steps are in real cities as they pragmatically have to move and develop and grow and lead for their citizens. So the first question I have for all of the panelists is to help us think about good examples of AI in the city. So I'm going to start with John Paul. And if you could tell us about some of those great examples you've seen in New York, that would be great. Thanks.
Thanks, Allison. It is terrific to be here with everybody. I'm looking forward to spending the next hour together. I want to start by doing what we did when I was CTO of New York City, which is trying to help people understand what are we talking about here. So we created an AI primer, just so that people were starting with some base level of understanding that didn't have to be sensationalist. It could really be grounded in facts, because really what we're talking about here is a new way of writing software. So if you think about classical software programming, you input the rules and the data and you get answers. Well, now with machine learning, you're inputting the data and the answers and you're creating rules. And those rules can then be applied over and over again to different data sets. So even though, as Allison mentioned, it can feel magical, it's not magic, it's math at the end of the day. And the great thing is what the math and the computers can do well, we should do more of. And here are a few examples that I think are relevant, not just in New York where we did this, but to cities across the country and frankly, organizations everywhere. Think about what computers can do well versus what people do well. And do more of that with computers. So anomaly detection is a really good example. There is an organization in New York City, an agency called the Department of Citywide Administrative Services, and they run all the real estate for the city. And that includes paying the bills, like energy bills. They pay 15,000 energy bills every month. So that's about 200,000, almost 200,000 energy bills per year. They had people pouring through line by line, trying to figure out if they were being overcharged for the heat or the air conditioning on these energy bills. Number one, people are not actually that good at it. There are a lot of, I mean, just think about if that were your job, your eyes roll into the back of your head, and it's just a really tough thing to stick with. Well, computers are very good at that. And by implementing a really simple robotic process automation anomaly detection solution, they were able to save $5 million per year on the energy bills that taxpayers are footing here in New York, and freeing up the human beings to do work that human beings are better suited for. So I think that's a really good example of something that doesn't involve any personally identifiable information, doesn't impact human rights, but just helps an organization do its job better, and frankly, frees up human beings to do work that's more fulfilling. The second example I want to give is NYC Cyber Command. So Cyber Command is kind of what it sounds like. It's keeping cyberspace safe. And New York City has a lot of what we refer to as attack surface. So what the team did was they used 2.3 petabytes of data, 2.3 petabytes of data. That system they built using training on 2.3 petabytes now processes 11 billion events per day. That's hundreds of thousands of events per second, and has an uptime of 24/7, 365 at 99.99% availability. This is something that, unlike the energy bills, where human beings could do that, maybe they wouldn't do it as well as the computer, human beings simply cannot do this work. And so if you want to have these systems function and keep people safe from bad actors who are also using technology, you need to invest in these tools. And once again, it's a situation where this does not involve PII. This is really about threat detection. And it's a no-brainer for, I think, every city across the country to take a look at how they can implement these types of solutions.
Those are great. Thanks so much, John. And I want to take a minute to just welcome Santiago Garces, who it looks like you were able to slide in at the last minute, and that's great. Santiago is the Chief Information Officer in the city of Boston, and they've been doing a lot of work on AI. So we're really lucky to have him here with us today. All right, so we're working on good, positive examples of AI in the city. Anyone else want to chime in here?
I can bring up an example at the risk of running late and taking the mic, but I think that, as John was mentioning, there's one example that we did in South Bend, actually based on some technology that was coming out of Carnegie Mellon, was using computer vision to do assessment of our streets. And part of the challenge, one, work that could have been done by someone, but part of the challenge is when you have to do an assessment that is citywide, you end up getting into biases, like you have inconsistencies across different inspectors, and the ability of being able to generate that data with enough currency so that you could start seeing whether you did work, like you repaved some streets, what's the condition of the streets throughout time. And is one of those moments when we did the analysis using this computer vision technology, we were able to actually visualize equity gaps in the conditions of streets in different areas of town, and starting to correlate the conditions of the streets with income and with race. And it's like one of those examples where AI can actually help surface equity gaps and disproportionate impacts to communities, and then create plans where everybody's working out of the same data and out of the same reality of how is it that we're going to go back and build our roads in a way that is a little bit more equitable.
I'd be happy to jump in as well, Allison. So just for a little bit of context, San Antonio, where I sit, we're about an hour south of Austin, and we are a city of about 1.7 million people, majority Latino community. with some of the biggest public health disparities and income inequalities in the United States. And so equity is a really important topic that's very close to home to us. And I want to build off of Santiago's idea, because we piloted something very similar. And I think it highlights kind of the difference between the frameworks that we use to implement artificial intelligence applications and how important that is for us to achieve the types of outcomes that we are looking for. San Antonio really is a relatively small city government. We don't have a lot of capacity to build these tools in-house, so we rely heavily on purchasing these tools from third-party vendors. And similar to what Santiago is describing, we also leveraged AI for a street index analysis to basically provide a grade for all of our streets. And we procured a software tool to help us do this, leveraging artificial intelligence, machine learning, and computer vision to do that. And it spat out to us a result, right? A grade for all of our streets across all 500 square miles of San Antonio. Awesome, huge data processing, very good thing that a human can't do. However, when we went to City Council, our Public Works Department presented the results, and one of our council members spoke up and said, it's really interesting because the investment recommendation is to prioritize investments in our streets where they're in the wealthiest neighborhoods in our community. So why is the tool, can you explain why the tool is making a recommendation to invest in our wealthiest neighborhoods? And we went back to the drawing board and we said, we can't explain this. We can't explain why the tool's working. So let's go to the vendor. Let's bring in the Smart Cities team, which is my team, to query the vendor on this. And the vendor says, well, this is proprietary technology. We can't really unpack for you this black box. So I think that's a great example of, there are opportunities out there for AI, but it's really important for us to think critically about how we integrate those into decision-making frameworks and what are the rules or the policies that we should put in place to ensure that as the public sector, we can do things like explain the decisions that we are making, leveraging these automated, powerful automated tools. I tend to feel that the bar for the public sector should be set really high. We should be able to explain and interpret these algorithms to the extent that we can, but also acknowledging that some companies may not be able to actually explain the data model behind the algorithm itself either. So is that something that we're comfortable adopting as a municipal service, a tool or insight that we can't explain? I think this is an open question right now that a lot of cities are trying to debate and deliberate over.
So I'd love to build on Emily's comment there, and also just say that I love San Antonio. My ex is from there. I got to spend a good chunk of 20 years visiting on a regular basis, and even though I'm no longer married to a San Antonian, still love coming back to the city.
That's awesome.
So I think I'm here as maybe designated critic. I ran a lab for many years at the MIT Media Lab that produced a lot of people who were quite critical of AI technologies. And I'm a big believer in public interest technology, the idea that we want to think very carefully about the impacts on the broader public when we bring technologies into play. And what Emily just said about AIs that aren't transparent, aren't explainable, aren't reviewable, has a lot to do with sort of the history of AI in cities. And I would argue in many ways that sort of the first smart city technology many communities encountered was ShotSpotter, was this technology designed to figure out where gun violence was taking place. There are many police departments who found it a very useful tool in their arsenal. There are also many, many cities that have reviewed and discovered that more than 80% of the calls that they get from ShotSpotter, they can't trace to gun violence. And what this often ends up being is an excuse for police to have contact, often in minoritized neighborhoods. So this has become a very controversial technology over time. And so I loved this idea that we were starting with a positive prompt. Can you think about technologies that you're excited about within the city? So one that I'm really excited about is a nonprofit called WattTime. WattTime is based out of the Bay Area. they are very interested in this idea that there's different mixes of energy sources in the electrical grid at different times. There are moments in the middle of the day where there's a lot of solar energy on the grid. There are moments, when wind is high, when there's a lot of wind energy on the grid. There's also moments where dirtier sources like coal are in the grid. And you could make a choice to use energy at different times to charge your electric car, or run your refrigerator or freezer, or run a cooling or a heating system. And what WattTime has done is figured out how to make an API available that can be used from anything from a Nest thermostat. So you could make this decision at the home level to do this, all the way up to industrial equipment, where you might make the decision to engage in an industrial process at a moment where you're using low carbon electricity. What I love about this, as opposed to something like ShotSpotter, which is being imposed on people who don't have a lot of choice about it, the way this technology is getting rolled out is really around choice. You can opt into it and decide that this is something that matters to you. You can do it at the individual level. You could do it at the factory level. To me, building things around open APIs that people can access and review is another critical piece of all of it. So I wanted to shout out this piece of technology that I'm pretty excited about.
I think maybe if I can jump in, Allison, reacting to both Ethan and Emily's comments, I think that's where we see a role for companies like Credo, because it's really important that all industry is able to adopt AI responsibly, because it is going to be the future for business. Businesses are going to have to understand how to develop AI, how to implement it in their business. And I think Emily's question is highly relevant for state and local governments as they're considering which technology to procure. They want to make sure that the technology that they're procuring is responsible, that it is safe, that it has undergone some form of testing and certification. And I think that there's a huge role for companies like Credo in this ecosystem, but really for all companies developing and deploying AI to think critically about how they are documenting their system, how they are testing their system, and how they're certifying it. So you can actually very easily create a centralized governance of your AI model. And I think it's very incumbent upon companies that are contracting it and doing work, especially for public services, to be able to produce basic information about what AI model they're using, how they're training the data, how they're using training data for the AI model. They should be able to provide information about the monitoring and function of the system, both its expected uses and unintended and unexpected consequences. So there's a real responsibility, I think, for companies that are developing critical infrastructure in cities across America, but really globally, to be able to produce a transparency documentation. And that's one of the things that we work on quite a bit at Credo is you can have different types of governance artifacts depending on the type of AI model that you're using, but you should be able to be producing some information that can explain decisions made by the model. So to your question, Emily, I think that's a really important role for city governments to be able to understand what information can we request from companies, what information could practically be provided by an AI developer and deployer. And I think that certainly we should be asking companies for basic metrics around performance and accuracy and the type of model that they're using, the type of training data that they're using. And so again, just another push for the fact that this is technically feasible and it is very possible for companies to do this. So I'm so excited about the application of AI in cities. I think it does a lot of things that make our general lives better, just parking management or road management or infrastructure improvements. And all of them are going to rely quite heavily on AI, but being able to explain, how images were used or how metadata was created from geospatial images that are taking pictures of buses or bus routes or, drones that are hovering above our cities and using those images to improve our public infrastructure. I think we need to make sure that the companies that are developing this technology and using this data can explain how they are developing it and how they're using it. So just another push for transparency documentation like impact assessments or model cards, which are all very doable.
That's a great array of possible, I don't know, good things about AI in cities. Now, we've already started to surface some critiques of AI in cities too. I want to continue to build on that thread. So right now I'm going to ask you to pivot a little bit and talk to me about your major cautions that you have right now, or things that are jumping out at you, concerns. All right, so I think maybe Ethan, because you self-designated as the critic on the panel, we'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, the paradigm of the smart city, which I think we all know is debated in some cases, has the danger of becoming the surveillance city, right? And there's a version of the surveillance city which says we want to know, where parking is available so that we can alleviate congestion. Most of us are pretty enthusiastic about the fact that Google Maps keeps track of where users are going as a way of optimizing routes and trying to reduce traffic. But there's versions of surveillance that end up disproportionately affecting minoritized communities, people of color, lower income people. And many visions of smart city technologies are based around surveillance, and they're coming from a criminal justice paradigm. And in many cases, those tools don't do a very good job of recognizing a real problem of most AI models, which is that they sort of lock into place how the world is today. So to give a very concrete example of this, one of the things that people are studying right now in carceral technologies is AI and sentencing algorithms. So there are lots of systems out there that look at someone's criminal record and other background factors and basically try to make a risk assessment. Is this person going to be rearrested? And these judicial risk assessments end up being used to decide whether someone or not, ends up being given parole. The problem with this is that American justice systems aren't particularly fair. If you are a person of color, you are far more likely to have contact with police. You are far more likely to be rearrested, whether or not you are more likely to be committing a crime in the future. And so if you have an AI system that simply says, we're going to rearrest more Black and Latino people because we arrest more Black and Latino people, you're taking unfair systems and you're baking them into code. So as we start looking at AI and smart cities, as we start looking around things like, is this a dangerous place and should we put more, police resources there? There are ways in which what we may end up doing is taking biases that already exist in policing, in investment in society, and we build them into the code. I am not saying that we cannot use AI in responsible ways. What I am saying is, first of all, some cases we don't. In some cases, we are simply looking at this potential to make law enforcement more efficient, and we're baking these biases into it. The second thing I'm saying is that it's surprisingly hard to de-bias these technologies. If you want to take those judicial algorithms and essentially build a fair version of them, step one would be to have a city where white people and people of color are arrested at fair rates rather than having racism baked into your criminal justice system. And then step two is collect data. Step three is build models around it. Step one turns out to be really hard in that case. So understanding that AI systems are measuring the world as it is with its biases and unfairnesses in it, and that if we don't interrogate that when we incorporate that into systems, we end up reinforcing those biases in really complex ways.
Can I respond to Ethan? I don't disagree with some pieces of your premise. So I think foremost, AI or any piece of technology functions in part for an objective. And if we don't have clarity around the objective and what the outcomes that the technology is going to have, you can introduce also either uselessness, like it could be wasteful to have the model, but even worse, you can have like a worse outcome that you wanted. But I think that in some cases, when you're able to have clarity around those things, the technology can actually be quite helpful. And because there's another piece, is there's biases, and you started alluding to this. There's biases in the status quo. There's biases in policing already. There's biases in the patterns in which police respond to crime. And I'll tell you a little bit. When we implemented, this is from not in Boston, but in another city. When we implemented ShotSpotter, we started to measure the number of times that a person called when there's a ShotSpotter alert versus when it was reported by a resident. And when did we have both? And in the communities that had the highest proportion of shots being fired, actually a lower number of people reported shots. And when I would go to community meetings and people would say, yeah, I don't want to call the police. I don't want to call the police because I don't want someone to be able to tell that I called the police because I don't want to be retaliated against. Right. And when we installed ShotSpotter, actually the number of people that called to report shots started to go up. The number of people with, so it's not only about the number of dispatches that were being done automated, but you started to see both qualitatively and in the numbers that there's higher trust in the police responding to the shots. Not perfect, and again, there are situations that you described that, yeah, are the sensors calibrated for like a particular deployment? Are you actually getting good enough quality data? But I don't know. But I think that when you have clarity of what is the outcome that you want, and you're using the data from the sensors and from the machine learning to help support the outcome and understand the biases. So because the other part that I do agree with you, I don't fully disagree with you, is the generating machine learning models to predict things based on administrative data is generally a bad idea. Arrests are administrative data. Convictions are administrative data. Why? Because they're biased. They're also incredibly inconsistent. The way that we do, what a machine learning model is doing is taking this data, but the way that the data was generated changes depending on the way that we do a process. And in government, we're terrible about keeping track about how we do process consistently. One inspector, one person might do something differently than another person. So when we go and we put this in machine learning, we get false, we get things that are very inaccurate. So I think that generally staying away from doing machine learning on administrative data, or being really careful about getting data that confirms the outcomes, the labeling, to assess the quality of the model independently, I think that that's extremely helpful. And yeah, doing it in a way that you understand the risk of the application. Dispatching police and potentially putting people in harm or sentencing someone is very high risk. Figuring out whether a model is there or not.
And in the case of ShotSpotter, you have something that is being directly used to dispatch police, which you acknowledge is something that increases risk to those communities. You have no ability to review how that algorithm works because ShotSpotter has been very proprietary about it. And we know that construction noise, so from a nail gun, a jackhammer, or a hammer, turns out in many cases to lead to dispatch of police in communities of color. So for me, this is another one of these cases where before we link something very tightly to situations like individual safety, we need a Bill of Rights around our AI systems where we have the ability to review, we have explainability, and we have the ability to audit these things independently.
But so if I can push back on that, I think the explainability around how is it that ShotSpotter goes from an audio signature to determining and properly labeling it as a shot or as a piece of construction or whatnot. Sure, it'd be more helpful for us to know what is the percentage of false positive rates. And we know that any machine learning model doesn't get 100% anything right. Well, right? So understanding them disclosing those rates, I actually think that what would be more helpful is being able to have, in the case of ShotSpotter is less applicable, but in the case of other things, having publicly available data sets that we could use to benchmark the machine learning model against like what we think that like to be able to, for us, it's still, machine learning takes large volumes of data, highly dimensionalizes it, it makes it you're never going to be able to get full explainability, but I think that if we were able to all agree around the types of tests and what are the labels and the outcomes that they should be producing, at least we could create like a common framework of how we evaluate these things.
So
I think we could debate ShotSpotter for a long time. So Emily, I'd love to just move on to your thoughts here.
Sure. Yeah. Way to go on selecting ShotSpotter as our test case here, because that is obviously a really extremely controversial application of AI. I wanted to zoom out slightly and just sort of say, like, as a smart cities team, we have to deal with kind of the spectrum of artificial intelligence applications that our city departments are adopting in the absence of any federal regulation, state regulation, or public policy. And that spans all kinds of areas, machine learning for things like automating and sorting applications for housing vouchers, for example, or computer vision to detect anomalies in the public right-of-way, or natural language processing, to automatically capture customer feedback potentially. And you're not really interacting with a human, you're acting with a bot that's interpreting your voice. Generative AI, of course, is, the latest example of AI that everybody's hyped up about. All of these are becoming commercial applications that are hitting city governments today. And for me, as a smart cities team managing our department, we have oversight over 43 departments at the city who are finding various applications for all of these tools right now, and they are procuring it and they are using it. So, for us, it becomes a question of what really is the jurisdiction or, the tools that we have to not just regulate or write policy, but also enforce it. And I can't, emphasize enough that for a city our size of 13,000 employees, all of which are kind of interested in exploring these tools, we really have a strong and important education effort on our hands, to really help raise the bar and the level of awareness across our frontline civil servants who are doing the work on the day-to-day and may not have this kind of expert knowledge. It is a huge lift for us as a city to just get our city employees on a basic level of the awareness of the opportunities and the challenges with AI, not even to mention, writing a policy that is going to be effective and useful as a tool to regulate those applications. So when I think about, what are the tools that cities have, I think procurement language is a really great way to have that sort of broad-based enforcement at the contract level where, maybe you're doing a heavy lift internally to raise awareness across all these departments. But when it comes to enforcing the types of applications that we want to see in public service, I think procurement and contract language is a really great place to start. Another area that, cities have done is ordinances. Using ordinances, we've seen, San Francisco ban facial recognition, for example. I think that's kind of challenging. It's very broad-based, and we're basically saying no because we don't know. And I feel like a lot of cities really should come to the place where they can get to yes in a safe and ethical way. But the question again is like, how do you get there? And what I'm kind of excited about, and maybe building off a little bit of what Santiago was alluding to, is cities joining forces, because our biggest problem, I think, for collaborating with the private sector is incentivizing them to come to us with commercial applications that are already safe, already meeting a certain standard. And arguably there's a role that the federal government maybe could play in that space, but hasn't yet. And that our job is to work with them to customize those tools for the outcomes we want to see in our community. I think it's an important point to say that, algorithmic justice is a very hot topic, but in my community, I want to prioritize certain outcomes for my low-income people of color communities. I don't want the algorithm to be fair across the board. I want it to disproportionately prioritize service access for a specific marginalized group in my city. How do I work with a company to build an AI tool that's going to do that, right? So I think that's really where I'm landing right now in this space, is thinking about how cities can collaborate to sort of unionize in a way and adopt similar templates and tools at the procurement level, at the policy level, to really push back and incentivize those companies that are building all these different types of technologies if they want to work with us, they're going to have to adopt certain standards. And in the absence of federal regulation, I think that's where cities have to go right now, is to collaborate across each other.
Yeah, John Paul, I know you've had your, you've been wanting to say something, so don't let me jump in, but I have a point I wanted to make on what Emily just said.
Oh,
Why don't
please
we go
do.
with
Go for it, Avi.
Avi, and then you can close us out with this question, John Paul.
Yeah, I really like the trajectory that you're thinking about this on. I think it's really important to also think about good examples. So one good example I think is SB 1103 in Connecticut. I think that the work that Senator Maroney has done on introducing this artificial intelligence officer that can develop procedures that state agencies can use in developing and procuring and utilizing automated systems for critical decisions is a great model for thinking critically about how you're going to develop a process for procuring responsible technology. And like you said, the risk thresholds or just the different weighting of the model are going to change based on your goals. So the point is not to have, one standard, and but really to have the ability to understand what's happening with the AI model. Like, why are the weights being assigned in the way that they are? What are the risk thresholds, and how are you going to mitigate risk, and how are you going to use the model in a way that benefits the aims you're trying to achieve? I also think that there's a lot of good examples of algorithm design evaluations, algorithmic impact assessments in regulation at the federal and global level. I do think Section 207 of American Data Privacy Protection Act has an outline of an algorithmic impact assessment. Basic elements of that, I think, could be replicated at the city and state level because they're important things for any company using AI to be able to describe and explain. So just, I hope two examples that might be useful to you in that search. But I think that what you're talking about of using procurement as a lever to instigate change that is across enterprise and industry wide is really important. I do think that companies are responsible for explaining how that they're using AI systems and AI models. And I think walking that middle line of being excited about the technology and the implications it can have for, making urban planning even better at the city level should be balanced with a lot of what Ethan has brought up of how are you showing development and really employing responsible design practices from the very beginning. So over to you, John Paul.
I think this is awesome. I think Emily did a great job zooming out and giving us a high level overview, because communities, individuals, housing, education, so many issues here are at risk of being affected or are being affected already. Clearly, from everyone's comments, we need more transparency and accountability. It's not acceptable, especially for the public sector. I'd say for any organization, but especially for the public sector, to simply say, well, it's a black box, the vendor won't tell me, that's the end of it, I don't know how this works. Going back to what Ethan introduced to start off this round of the conversation, he really jumped to one of the most extreme examples, which is if something affects your bodily autonomy or your literal freedom, you want to understand why it's doing that. You want to make sure it's done correctly, and it's not based on a history of racism, discrimination, and inequity. There was an expose a few years ago by ProPublica on the use of some AI systems to do exactly this in terms of bail and sentencing. I think it was out of Florida. Seems like a lot of these stories come out of Florida these days. And the vendor had a black box, and the public sector folks said, well, we're just using what they gave us. They tell us it works. And the vendor had said, well, we don't use any data from protected classes, race, sex, ethnicity. Well, it turned out they were using zip code, which in the United States of America is very heavily correlated with things like race, ethnicity, immigration status. And so they were creating a bunch of bias in these recommendations that affected people's life and liberty. Here in New York, we saw that happen, but we also, as Santiago pointed out, knew that there was inequity in the existing system. We knew there was human fallibility, human bias, and we wanted to see what we could do with the technology. So we're very thoughtful, working with the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, with academics, with private businesses, to create a pretrial risk assessment, a risk of someone creating a crime before they go to trial. So basically, if they're low risk, then society should let that person go free until they are actually found guilty, if they are found guilty. But if they're high risk, then maybe the right thing for society is to keep that person in jail until that trial happens. This was specifically done with the understanding that there has been bias, there has been, frankly, racism baked into this process in the past, and we wanted to try to create a more fair process. And we knew we wanted to do it in a way that was as transparent as possible, so that whatever recommendation, because ultimately a human judge made the decision, but whatever recommendation was made could be recreated on paper. Someone could understand why the recommendation that affects their own liberty was what it was. And we thought that this was a good way to use these technologies while recognizing the inherent problems, to try to actually improve society based on, the imperfect past. So with that, I see Ethan's got his hand up. I'll pass it back to you.
Well, I just wanted to respond by sort of saying, look, I'm not picking ShotSpotter because it's the most extreme example. I'm picking it because it's actually been in use in US cities since 1997, and it's in use in 130 cities. And I thought it was super interesting that in the opening of this, a bunch of y'all came up with examples of using visual systems to evaluate road quality. It's always interesting when people are coming up with the same examples, but this is an example that we've actually seen in the field for 20 plus years. So I'm not just cherry picking an extreme example. I'm actually probably picking the most pervasive example of use of AI in a city context at the moment. But let's pivot for a second. Virginia Eubanks, one of the best scholars in this space, has a wonderful book looking at what you might think of as quotidian AI. So systems that are trying to figure out, when do we decide to send out social services because we're worried about child welfare? When do we decide how to prioritize who gets housing in the city of Los Angeles? And what she's able to find interrogating those systems is that even though they're built by people who are being very smart and very thoughtful and with the best intentions, they tend to bake in some really unpleasant consequences. Within the LA system, if you are an alcoholic who gets clean, you actually reduce your chances of getting housing from the city. And that's the sort of perverse incentive that no one really wants to bake into those algorithms. The problem with baking them into the algorithm is that you lose the ability of a human caseworker to come in and say, I understand the situation, I understand where the person is, I'm going to make the decision around it. All I am saying in this is that there's an enormous amount of hype, there's an enormous amount of sales cycle around this, and there are some really legitimate criticisms, not all of which are going immediately on the hardest ones about bodily autonomy and people being arrested. Some of them are around essential services, and the investigations that we're seeing around this tend to show that there are systemic problems that get baked into the code when we end up rolling out these systems without the ability to have transparency and auditability associated with them.
I'd like to thank everyone for all of those critiques. They're really, in my opinion, spot on. I'm hearing themes of, as John Paul already mentioned, transparency, accountability. I'm also hearing about maybe impact assessment and figuring out what communities are being impacted by a lot of these AI technologies and how we can show accountability with that. I'm wondering if you can all speak to what you think the future of AI is, or what the next steps are AI. You can talk about a project, you could talk about guiding policies. We've all worked on different parts of this. I thought we could start this off with Avi, since you have been working a lot on the policy from the federal standpoint. And we're sort of talking about city AI, but Emily already mentioned this federal role to it as well.
Yeah, and I think there's been some great comments in the chat. I saw Algorithmic Accountability Act was mentioned, which I also want to give a plus for. I think amazing work has been done there. I think when we look at what the future of AI should be, it's certainly here to stay, right? The genie is out of the bottle. So in many ways, it's about creating a society that we want to live in with AI. And I think a lot of that depends on how we introduce transparency and accountability to AI-enabled resources. I think at the city level, there's been amazing efforts already because people are so involved and concerned about public uses of AI, which I think Ethan and John Paul have really outlined very well, and Santiago as well. Emily, I think procurement is the lever. I do think that that's a near term place where we should see a lot of action from the cities and states, because I think it's the highest bar and the most important area where we should have real requirements on transparency and reporting obligations. At the global level, obviously, we see things like the EU AI Act moving. In the US Congress, there's the Senator Schumer Forum. A lot of congressional hearings have been held over the last 2 years on data privacy and data governance and artificial intelligence. And I think that a lot of good work has been done to try to introduce more transparency and accountability mechanisms. So I think what we will see is what we've seen in the environmental and privacy and cybersecurity space, with a focus on impact assessments. But I think broader categories of transparency, documentation, and governance artifacts are also being discussed and researched. Things like watermarking, licensing, certifications. All of these, I think, are tools, and it's incumbent upon us to think really critically about how they work best. In which applications of AI does a particular governance artifact work best? And I also think that there's still a lot of work to be done on making sure that the end user understands the transparency that's being provided by the AI system. So we've done some work on algorithmic impact assessments and what makes sense to a regulator, and the different let's say metrics you would include in that, or even things like disparate impact analysis, which Jean Paul is very familiar with, may not make sense to the end user when they're trying to understand, why was this the result? Why did I not get this job? Or why am I in this picture that's been taken, at a traffic stop? So I do think we need more work there. But the last point that I will make, and my plug again, is for having a centralized repository of metadata for companies that are using AI, and requiring them to understand transparency reporting obligations would be the future I hope for.
Thank you.
I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, next and build on that. It's been mentioned already by others on the panel, but I think collaboration is key here. If every city tries to do this in isolation in a silo, we're just going to end up with subpar results. One example is the Cities Coalition for Digital Rights. This is something that was started by New York, Amsterdam, and Barcelona a handful of years ago. It's now over 60 cities worldwide, including San Antonio and Boston now. And that's a great example of sharing best practices, learnings in a very quickly, rapidly evolving space, but it's still mostly European cities. And so I think we need to do a better job of getting American cities on board, and perhaps having more conversations, especially as national level regulatory regimes get put into place here in the United States, that American cities are really sharing best practices. I was able in New York to hire a director of AI in 2019 who had a PhD in machine learning from Stanford, had been an entrepreneur, created a machine learning company, had been an Aspen Tech Fellow. Like, most cities in America can't do that. And so we really want to, if we believe in doing the best by the American people, let's share. Let's do a better job of sharing what we can. So whether that's the New York City AI strategy, if anyone wants to read it, NYC AI strategy, just look it up. It's online. But I think that's the first thing. I think procurement's the second thing, because as Emily pointed out very clearly, like, that's the lever. Most of the stuff will not be built. It's going to be bought. And number one, getting the right kinds of rules in place so it's done appropriately. But two, use the buying power of the massive public sector, especially the local public sector, when you add up hundreds of cities across the country. That's going to sway the behaviors of a lot of private sector companies, because they want access to that market. If it's one city, especially if it's a smaller city, maybe they would ignore it. If it's a whole mass, a coalition of cities together, suddenly that can change behaviors. And then the last thing I'll mention is regulatory. Here in New York, we've started on several different regulatory approaches. We've got some transparencies through local law 144. We report out uses of automated decision systems, which is, for most people, similar enough to AI. It's kind of overlapping. Now, there are only a few dozen tools being reported every year, so we can question whether that's really a holistic view of what's being done here in New York City government, but it's a start. We've also put in place a law around the use of AI in the hiring process, resume reviews, candidate assessment, looking at someone's behavior on video and determining something based on that. So now that needs to be made clear and transparent that those tools are being used. And there also needs to be an annual audit into those tools, the data they're trained on, what kind of disparate impact they might have. It's not a perfect law. It's something that, for example, doesn't include disability status or sexual orientation, or there are a number of things it doesn't include. And so it shouldn't have been hard coded. It should have been tied to human rights law or protected groups. But that's a good example of something where I think if that had been done by a coalition of cities working together, I think we would have ended up with a better law. And from the standpoint of the private sector, it's much easier for private sector companies to comply with a single standard that is shared across lots of places than to be constantly adjusting to a million slightly different laws. And so I think there's just a lot of value in collaboration. I hope that's the direction that American cities head.
I want to add, if I can, Allison, one last point to build off of what John is saying and around, the points about collaboration and regulation. The other thing that I'm excited about for the future, but I think is very critical, is the resident's voice. I feel strongly, and this addresses one of the questions in the chat, that to see change, our public has to be vocal and active about what they do and do not want to see in their communities. I encourage anybody who is a resident of a city to talk to your council member. Seriously, the council shapes significantly the type of work that we do and do not do in the policies that emerge from our city government. So I don't believe that the stage should be set exclusively by city governments and private entities working in collaboration. I believe strongly that the public has a voice and a role. And in San Antonio, we pride ourselves on having taken that approach for the development of our Smart Cities program. We spent a year talking to residents as well as city staff about what does a smart city mean to them. And so our plan is a community-driven vision that is shaped directly by those discussions digitally and in person with our residents that happened over the course of a year. So I would just add that the residents' voice is critical in this, because they are the people who live, work, and play in our cities and are affected the most by these technologies and tools.
I would add and build on that. I think Ethan made a great point in that, some of these technologies have been around for a while, and there has been periods of time where there's been a lot of optimism around the promise with a discount around the impacts, risks. And in Boston, we are being very intentional about creating the governance structures and the processes by which we involve the communities and the communities that are the most at risk. And even letting them, and again, it's beyond AI too, I think, is thinking about, there's all sorts of underlying technologies that have an impact. Public safety cameras. Everything that we do has an impact, and we have both the grace and the challenge that in the public sector, everything that we do has such a profound impact on people's lives. Whereas we're educating your kids, we're responding when you're having a heart attack, we're responding when you feel unsafe. Like, everything that we do is life or death, and it makes the stakes really hard. I think that creating those processes. The other thing that I would say is, and it goes a little bit to the point that I made before, John brought a great example of Compass, which was this predictive model to determine sentencing. The reason that ProPublica identified the biases is because of open data. They were able to test the model against open data and then realize that the false positives and the false negatives were disproportionately depending on race. And that's where I was trying to go, is like, I think that there's a huge opportunity, and both for the people that are developing these technologies, but for us who have to evaluate whether they work and whether they work in a way that is biased, or they work in a way that is reliable enough. I think that creating open frameworks and open data that allows us to validate and test whether the models have bias, whether the models are performing to the level that we need them before we put them in production. That's an exercise that can only happen when it's done openly. And I think that it feeds back into the governance, where we're able to reassert people what is it that it's doing and how is it that it works. I personally care less about how it's actually, like, what are the weights of the model, but I do care about, like, what are the impacts and the implications on the people that are being impacted by the decisions made.
So I completely agree with Santiago that having access to this data is critical. I do think it's worth asking the question, who then does the work of figuring out whether this is an appropriate tool to use or not? And that's a hard thing to ask communities who are disproportionately impacted by these tools. That absolutely does have to be part of the procurement process. It absolutely does have to be part of what cities, states, other jurisdictions are doing and making decisions about this. Santiago, I don't think that everything that cities does is a matter of life and death. I think we can think about a sliding scale. We can have all sorts of philosophical arguments about whether the potholes in the street are ultimately going to lead to auto accidents, but that's a categorically different thing than where we're deploying law enforcement. And I do think we can make a general rule that there are places where we are more likely and less likely to be impacting people's lives and freedom or economic futures. There's a reason why people have looked at these hiring systems and essentially said, we can't do modern day phrenology and basically determine that you're going to be a bad employee because the algorithm doesn't look like how you look in a video. That has real economic impacts for people. We can look at these things and we can prioritize where we try automated systems and where it's too dangerous in terms of disparate impact on people to try them at this point.
All right, folks. Well, we've kind of used up all the time here. I'm just going to say quickly a couple of things. Several questions came through that discussed basically themes of trust. And I think we got to a lot of those questions through this last part of the conversation. So I'm going to just thank you for bringing up these ideas of involving the community and then also increasing transparency and regulation of AI. I'd like to just end with one of the questions that kind of asks for where we can go next on learning more. So one respondent or one person in the audience said, thank you to all the speakers for such great content. Besides ProPublica and Smart City Strategies, what other sources should students read to better understand AI uses and maybe you can all just lightning say one thing that you think that a student who's interested in learning more about this should look into.
The Algorithmic Justice League.
There are a number of organizations. AI Now just came out with an important report on primarily focused on compute. Data and Society Research Institute, Algorithmic Justice League. There are a number of folks who are doing a good job looking at this from outside of government as well as the perspective of governments themselves.
I would look at the NIST AI risk management framework, which gives you a good framework to think around risks in the context of the usage of AI. That's something that we've been using in Boston to think about this two things, but not everything's life or death, but we do have some life or death things that we deal with in cities.
I would plus one everything that's been said so far, but add to that the OECD catalog of trustworthy tools on AI has not only tool providers that are evaluating AI deployers and developers, but also metrics for doing so. And the UK AI assurance portfolio also released their version of this, which links to the OECD database and includes the UK regulatory framework and their assessment of how providers are providing AI assurance.
Yeah, you all are my people because you hit all of my all of my selections. So I might just add a couple books on political theory that I think are really interesting and forward thinking. If You Dare, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, but also Future Politics by Jamie Susskind. I think both of those are really great books that kind of put into context a lot of this from a political perspective.
And I just realized one thing that's actually highly relevant to the question is something created by the CTO of Barcelona, a friend named Michael Donaldson, called the Global Observatory on Urban AI. And there's an atlas that looks at, I think, 62 different cities around the world and some of the activities. It's a growing body, so it's certainly not a complete view, but certainly useful if somebody wants to understand AI in cities.
Incredible. All right, well, I'd like to first thank all of the audience for being here today. We really appreciate your time. We wouldn't have a chat without you. And then I'd also like to thank all of the panelists for taking the time out of your day to tell us about everything you're working on, things you're working on, and share some of your thoughts. It was a very, I appreciate that you had a little bit of disagreeing opinions. It makes it more interesting. So thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to see you, and thanks to the audience, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.